I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Nathan Taylor of the Election Truth Alliance. This is going to be covering a controversial topic, namely the security of U.S. elections. The Election Truth Alliance has been looking at the 2024 election and some issues pertaining to election security in Florida and Pennsylvania. I know this is a hot topic, one that causes a lot of debate and controversy, but I wanted to give Nathan a hearing and understand what the findings of the Election Truth Alliance are, and hopefully we will have further discussion with the Election Truth Alliance in the future. I understand skepticism, but I think this is an interesting topic, and when a publicist came to me asking me to cover this, I said, sure. I think it would be an interesting conversation, and I hope you find it as fascinating as I did. Before we get to the conversation, though, I'd like to remind you that this show is listener-funded, with the exception of my one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window. If you'd like to become a sponsor, you can join him by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. Otherwise, if you'd like to support the show, as I said, this is pretty much mostly listener funded. So, patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews if you want to support the show financially. It is greatly appreciated, by the way, if you do. Also, check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson's wallstreetwindow.com, the best and most honest financial and trading newsletter. I've had listeners make a return on investment from Mike's trading tips, so sign up now, and I believe you can also get a copy of Mike's ebook free of charge if you sign up for the newsletter. That ebook is called The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I've ever used. Very interesting book, and I think Mike does great work. Honest trading and financial news. So, wallstreetwindow.com, Mike Swanson, he'll do you right. And with that being said, let's get right to the conversation with Nathan Taylor. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to have on the show. I'm only just learning about the work he and others have been doing at what's known as the Election Truth Alliance. Got my tongue tied there. Election Truth Alliance. I'm speaking with Nathan Taylor, and we're going to be talking about the 2024 election. How are you doing, Nathan?
I am excellent. Thanks so much for having me on a Wednesday of all days. I feel like everyone is, this week has been very interesting for everyone. So thanks for taking the time.
So if you could, let my listeners know what the ETA is and how it came to be.
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself and then really what kicked off the ETA and what we've been doing. So my background specifically, currently I work for the ETA as one of the executive directors of public engagement. That means I kind of go out and I share our findings and help do publicity. But I'm also, specifically my background is in cybersecurity and information systems. Civilian side, I've worked in cybersecurity. I have a degree in network security. I spent time working at a company that provided real-time network monitoring for banks and a couple other entities. Before that, and in conjunction with that, I've spent time as a 25 Bravo computer tech specialist with the Army National Guard, doing some of the similar things, but more along the signal communication side. So that's a little bit about my background. That really was one of the reasons why the ETA helped come to be, was because myself and some of the other amazing members of the ETA have different backgrounds in statistics, cybersecurity, data analysis, political science, and really what kicked off the formation of the ETA, we're now only a little over a year old, is, and by the way, the ETA is nonpartisan. We're nonprofit, and really our purpose is to spread awareness and investigate, U.S. elections and verify them and ensure everything is, free and fair, as we're being told. Well, what kicked off the formation of the ETA was just after the 24 election. Well, during the 24 election, on election night, we had over 200 bomb threats called in across the U.S. And those were ultimately attributed to Russian email domains. that's what piqued my interest originally. And that's really what led me down the path to start asking questions, investigating, and starting to publish some of the other concerns we were finding. And then I started to meet with other members of the ETA and helped push forward an organization that was actually able to begin investigating the problems we were finding at scale, doing the analysis. We've put out 4 of the 7 swing states so far, and an analysis that we'll talk about. And as well as that, we started, raising funds to continue pursuing investigations, but also to pursue legal action based on if there are problems or not. Which at this point we do have an active lawsuit in Pennsylvania for some of the same concerns around the 24 election, mostly the infrastructure and any known vulnerabilities to that infrastructure as we go forward as well.
What's the biggest pushback you get for this kind of work? Because I think there's a tendency for people to not want to believe that elections are insecure, right? Or they write it off as conspiracy theory. So where do you think people are maybe giving you the wrong pushback, and what's the pushback you usually get?
Well, I will say, since it's been a little over a year of doing this almost every day, the pushback has changed, but originally the pushback we were getting was exactly that, right? Um, Americans, both our government and our people, naturally believe our elections are the freest and fairest. That's what we're told. That's what we believe in. It's an American exceptionalism. The problem is, um, we're not really finding at this point that is absolutely backed up by some of these other concerns we'll talk about. But it's that mindset. It can't happen here. And that makes it very difficult to then actually talk about the provable concerns, the known vulnerabilities, and the known compromises of some of these systems that we have now started to make public, and actually started to investigate. And that's kind of the pushback. Is a lot of the time the state officials, are told everything is perfect. But then when, we follow that up with actual, well, here's the hard data, the facts, here's the expert opinion on these systems, they just really aren't willing to engage. At this point, we've met with, I believe, over 5 different states, federal governments, their secretary of state or their staff, presented both our analysis, but also our other findings and concerns around the 2 major systems that run our elections, count our votes. And it's just kind of, it really feels like it's less of, let's absolutely make sure there isn't problems, and more of, well, we can't bring into question our elections because that would be bad, is kind of that pushback we get. People, though, at this point, the average everyday American who is engaging with some of the things that we're putting out, they are concerned. It's less now of is it possible, and more of how can we make sure it's not happening, and how can we stop it as we go forward.
I also wanted to ask, I'm curious, do you see the work that ETA is doing as being in line with previous work on this issue? What I mean by that is, I remember back in, what was it? I think 2006 or thereabout, there was an HBO documentary called Hacking Democracy, which was about the Diebold election systems and
Yes,
electronic
yes.
voting. Do you see your work as being in line with or building off some previous work? How is it this similar and how is it different?
Absolutely. It is, in my opinion, a continuation of raising the same problems. That was some of the investigation we've done, is as we've reviewed and started looking at the vulnerabilities of the current major systems, which is ES&S and Dominion, now Liberty Vote, that span at least 70% of the US's voting infrastructure. We started asking questions of, well, has there been problems in the past with voting infrastructure? When did that really start happening? And yes, we at this point, it looks like a strong continuation of the same problems and the same concerns leading back to the early 2000s. And if you're familiar, really one of the only reasons we have the current voting infrastructure we do is because after 2000, 2004, with the hanging chads in Florida in 2000 and Ohio in 2004, the man in the middle concerns with Spoonamore, that really pushed us into the current voting systems we use because they cut up Diebold and
I was going to
actually,
say real quick, I'm glad you mentioned the hanging
yeah,
chads because that one was one that always got me.
that one was interesting. I'm still, reviewing some of the interesting pieces of it. And we did recently release a report, um, going back and doing the same type of analysis we did for the 24 election, all the way back to 1984. And we asked that question. Well, when did we not use the current voting systems or earlier types of voting systems? And what does that look like? Does that look normal or not? And absolutely, this is a continuation of the same problems and the same concerns. Diebold had the same issues and questions we're asking right now, which is who runs and owns these companies? Is there any potential for bad actors to go in and mess with those systems or even compromise them? And we're raising the concern that there is absolutely. And we have some of the evidence to suggest it's happening. And it's been happening, and it could continue to happen if we don't actually do something about it.
So take us through this. How are these voting systems compromised exactly? For instance, you mentioned how they could be sort of hacked or gamed. How would take us through how that would work?
Yes, yes. And I won't even have to tell you my personal opinion. I will tell you public fact and the opinions of experts. But first and foremost, a little bit of background. The pushback as well is every state runs their own election, right? It would be really difficult to change the outcome of elections because you would have to mess with every state. You'd have to have people in every county. Well, that's what led us down the path of looking at the systems and how we actually run our elections in the US. So most people may not be aware, but there's only, a handful of major voting system brands that count nearly 100% of the US's votes. So even hand-marked paper ballots, even mail-in, even election day, it's all counted by a machine. And there's two major brands that is a majority of those machines used across the swing states, Florida, Texas, etc. Those two major brands, as I mentioned before, span more than 70% of those systems. And that is ES&S and Liberty Vote Now, which was Dominion. And I'm sure we all know a little bit about Dominion because of what the concerns were in 2020. So with that in mind, we did and have started to publish. Some of our cybersecurity experts that work within the ETA have been digging into these companies and these systems for a while now. And that is where we've started to make public a couple things that I like to say in my normal catchphrase at this point is conflict of interest. But so before we jump into the known vulnerabilities, let's talk about, as you asked, like, how could you do it? How do we know that they're compromised or potentially vulnerable? And what are some examples of that? So first and foremost, we have now known instances of these two major brands, their software and their hardware being compromised by US actors. And some of those people have actually been put in prison for it. So the main ones are, I'll pull it up here. So you probably heard about this previously, which was in Coffee County, Georgia, just after the 2020 election. We had operatives go in and actually gain access to the election management system. They were able to gain access to the hard drives and the voting machine data, and potentially take copies and images of that. That was reported by AP, and that's actually in some documents in Georgia for their court records. We also had Mesa County, Colorado, Tina Peters and some other individuals. Same thing. Went in, gained access to the hardware and the software of these systems. And Michigan, same thing. They actually took some of those vote counting computers, those tabulation machines from the county, and took them back and were performing unauthorized tests and got access to the hardware. That was both of the major systems, by the way, ES&S and Dominion. And the reason why we bring that up as a precursor to these other things we're finding is because that would be the first step you would need to potentially know how to mess with these systems going forward. And that happened, just after the 2020 election. Because, cybersecurity wise, if I was able to get my hands on these proprietary closed source hardware and software, I could then run vulnerability tests on it, determine how is it vulnerable, and then make my own malware or make my own, way of compromising those systems. Now, that doesn't account for the harder part, which is how could I actually do it at scale? How could I, put the malware on the systems or whatever? And that's still, the question we're kind of wanting to pursue right now. But that's at least the foundation showing, the intent of, well, we know people got access, got their hands on these systems, their software. And it begs the question, what would be other symptoms that come out of a successful, compromise of an election and actually changing votes around?
Now, you mentioned conflicts of interest. Can you get into that? Where would the conflicts of interest be with, say, Dominion or some of these others?
Yes. So that is some of the things we've flagged and has actually been flagged well before us. And the same concerns were raised by Diebold actually before they were shut down. Some of the same problems about maybe partisan leaning or bad actors inside of those organizations. Well, we have started to ask those same questions. We'll start with Dominion. now bought out, now Liberty Vote. If you're somewhat familiar, the buyer of that major voting system brand, Scott Leindecker, previously served as a Republican director of the St. Louis City Board of Elections. He's also the founder of one of the larger electronic poll book companies, No Ink. And, that has kind of raised some alarms because he's just after buying the company, publicly endorsed some of at the time, president's policies around elections being federalized or, having certain restrictions. And we kind of bring that up as a concern because these companies are trusted to run our elections. They're very black box, meaning, we're not publicly allowed to review the software or the hardware. It's very proprietary. And that brings up a concern of, well, should a company like this be allowed to have partisan ties? Because if you could, influence those systems or those machines for one candidate or one party, that would be a major concern. Now, that's just Dominion. As I said, ES&S is where we've done a lot of our focus because they span a majority of the swing states and they are a much larger. I think they account for roughly 60% or so of the voting infrastructure. They are the main brand. And there has been concerns. Multiple newspapers now have actually published this, talking about what ES&S has been up to, some of the individuals in the company or that have worked for the company, and some things that they have found. So, for example, just after 2018, a individual who worked for the Trump campaign or worked under the Trump administration, Chris Walshkin, left I believe he was, I'll have to see which entity he worked for under the administration, but Walshkin left and actually became the vice president of the systems, security systems for ES&S, and he actually just left the company after the 24 election. One of the concerns there is he's had some bad blood in his previous administration position, and he's not really the only person that has come and gone from these major companies that's kind of brought up these red flags of, could they potentially lean one way? And on top of that, we have now started to find documented concerns around ES&S contributing funds, bribes, and lobbying to political officials across the U.S. In the last 11 years. And that's another one of those things that kind of raises red flags for, we're entrusting our elections to these companies, and these companies have been caught soliciting donations and actually lobbying without reporting it in order to get their contracts approved and get their equipment purchased and used and expanded across the U.S. They've been on multiple occasions caught sending people to Las Vegas, giving them flights, giving them meals, giving them rooms in order to potentially influence people buying their contracts at the state levels. So it's more or less so that type of behavior that kind of raises red flags. There's been other examples, and this is something that we've learned during our Pennsylvania lawsuit, is that one of the individuals named in our lawsuit, the current Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, had received direct donations, lobbying donations from ES&S for over $1,000, and he actually, privately visited their headquarters prior to becoming the Secretary of State or Secretary of the Commonwealth when he worked in Philadelphia. So we're very concerned as we go forward. How can we actually make sure that these companies are above board, that they are actually doing their jobs and their systems are actually secure? And we now have discovered that there are known vulnerabilities to the core software of some of the systems used during the 24 election, or the same core software as well.
Can you talk about those vulnerabilities? I think you've said there's over
Yes.
420 documented vulnerabilities. We can't go through all of them, of course, but
Well, I'll just tell you the highlights here. So New York State, they did an independent test of the major voting system software they were using for ES&S. And that software version is 6.3.0.1. The software version used in some of the counties in Pennsylvania per their records is 6.3.0.0. Distinguishably no difference. And we suspect that same software was the common software used across the U.S. during the 24 election. So same core software. When they did that test to their voting systems in that software, and that software governs both the vote counting computers at the precinct level, the election management system at the county level, it's the whole suite of the software. They identified, per paper, I believe, 430 source code vulnerabilities. And some of these source code vulnerabilities, and I'm quoting from their reports, could allow the modification of memory which is how we store our votes during those systems, during those counting. They're stored in local memory. Privilege escalation, meaning, I could give myself administrator access to change things. Here's some of the other fun things: removal of audit logs, and obviously the potential manipulation of the counting and the recording of the votes. So if those vulnerabilities existed and they were identified prior to the 24 election, that software was in use during the 24 election in at least Pennsylvania, and I suspect other states as well. Same software, same core version. And it begs the question of, well, if I had the means to design malware that could exploit those vulnerabilities, could I then change the outcome of certain elections or certain counties, change votes around? And that is where we have, made public our other concerns. And you mentioned, maybe reviewing some of the work we've been doing when it comes to doing election forensics on voting behavior, which has been used in other elections like Russia to flag concerns around vote manipulation being successful.
So take us through your findings when it comes to, I know I want to talk about Florida because I'm in Florida right now, but
Yeah.
I'm initially actually from Pennsylvania.
Oh, well, perfect for you then. I'm sure you loved reading some of our things. We're like, wow, Pennsylvania and Florida, those are the two highlights.
So I want to take us through Pennsylvania, and I guess particularly one of the counties you focused on is Cambria County and ballot processing issues.
Yes. So high level, as I mentioned before, the ETA, some of our initial work before we really started digging into the machines and the systems, because we didn't know at the time some of these things. It was very difficult to determine the election infrastructure. It took a lot of investigation. Prior to having that information, we first decided one of the ways that we could look at elections going forward, and within the ETA and hopefully without the ETA, is using election forensics, which is a form of looking at voting behavior based off just statistics. We actually found multiple credible experts who've been doing this in Russian elections, the country of Georgia as well. And so some of those is like Peter Klimek. He's got heat maps that we like to reference. We've got Roman Udot and Sergei Shvilkin. They're all different forms of statisticians or physicists or election experts that use just basic math and statistics to look at the outcome of an election and flag if there's any consistent pattern or trend that could be caused by external influence. So we took their work and we did those analysis for, at this point, 4 of the 7 swing states. Nevada was our first, and then Pennsylvania was our next big focus as well, and then North Carolina, and we've recently gotten into Michigan, and next on the list is Wisconsin and some of the other final ones. We've also done some preliminary reports for Florida we'll talk about next. And what our analysis has flagged is we pulled from the county and the state the precinct level voting data, which tells us how many votes per precinct and also tells us how many voters per precinct. Those are the 2 critical pieces of information we need to do this more complex analysis. And based on the experts, what the experts flag is that there should be little to no relationship between how many people show up to vote and cast their votes and any one candidate at the precinct or the polling location level. So that's at the lowest level. And they tested this on Russia, where Russia has been accused of ballot stuffing and cheating in their elections for the last decade or more. And they analyzed Russian voting behavior and they flagged certain effects. And they actually saw the effect where higher turnout per polling location on average benefited one party, which was Putin. And they think it was because they were going in and stuffing votes for Putin or bussing in people and making them vote or asking them to vote for that one candidate, giving them kickbacks and rewards like, hot meal or whatever. And this has been documented. So with that in mind, we said, let's look at U.S. voting behavior across all of these different states, all of these different counties at the precinct level. And what we immediately flagged in Nevada and then in Pennsylvania, and now in all of these swing states that we've done this analysis for, that we are seeing voting behavior that is consistent with known vote manipulation, like in those Russian elections, where higher turnout on average benefits one candidate and one party consistently, independent of demographics or location. And one of the biggest red flags we've raised is we did this analysis for Clark County, Nevada. That's Las Vegas. That is the arguably one of the most liberal left-leaning counties in the U.S. They have, I think, over a 100 or 200,000 voter advantage for the Democratic Party. And yet we were flagging the abnormal voting behavior there. And we were actually seeing in polling locations and precincts in that county in the middle of Las Vegas, the places that had more votes cast generally began to favor one party independent of what we would expect to see. And it's consistent enough to where we've documented it now across multiple counties, multiple states across the US. And we're flagging at this point that it is so consistent, this voting behavior, that we are concerned it could be a potential vote changing algorithm that could have been introduced to these systems maliciously or whatnot. So that's the high level concerns. And then we took that and we actually began to investigate some of the most concerning counties in the US, which is why we went to Pennsylvania, why we went and, we're doing some local reaches out to Cambria, Erie, and Allegheny, which is what's labeled in our lawsuit, those three counties. And we did discover some of the concerns. So, for example, Cambria County, as you mentioned, all of their precinct voting systems stopped working on election day. So they blamed it on maybe a misprinting of the ballots, or we don't truly know. We're just taking what the county tells us. But they could not scan their votes during election day, and they had to hand duplicate and then actually scan them later in the day when those systems did work. And the reason why we highlight that county is because, as we mentioned, if we're concerned about a compromise of the voting systems and potentially an introduction of malware and an algorithm that is influencing the outcome of those counties at the precinct level, well, because they had to hand duplicate the ballots, we were told by public officials, and they made statements about how many ballots they had to hand duplicate. So they said they hand duplicated roughly 65,000 ballots, and then they scanned them into the machines. And that's important, and we label this in our lawsuit, because if there's a problem with the counting of the votes using these vote counting computers, these systems, well, one of the symptoms would be discrepancies in the digital reports versus the actual physical ballots. And when reviewing their official records, they're only showing around 55,000 election day votes being cast. But they said they hand duplicated around 65,000 ballots. That's a discrepancy of around 10,000. And we flagged that because we are concerned, when looking at the analysis we've done and we've made public, that if this is a vote changing algorithm, one of the side effects could also be vote deletion, which could create missing ballots as well. So that's kind of what's highlighted in our lawsuit. That's the high level for Pennsylvania, at least. And then, we can dig into Florida and even more of the concerns we're finding there.
Yeah, so the concerns in Florida, a lot of this has to deal with, well, I want to get into the specific county that you looked into. Is it
Yes.
St. Lucie?
St. Lucie, yes.
Okay, what happened in St. Lucie County that set off red flags?
Yeah. So I wasn't aware of this, but one of the locals, one of the amazing investigative journalists that reached out to us is Allison Green. She's been looking at U.S. elections for at least the last 3 or 4 years. She reached out to the ETA and started sharing some of her findings from public record requests at the county level. But on top of that, before that piece, she also made public to us some of the documentation around confirmed vulnerabilities, or a confirmed compromise of 2 counties in Florida back in 2016, and that was attributed to Russia. So she told us about that first, because that kind of sets the stage for some of the problems we're seeing now, where she said that the CIA and I believe the Department of Homeland Security and a few other federal agencies detected malware on 2 counties in Florida. One of them was St. Lucie County back in 2016. And that malware was, ultimately, they didn't determine if the malware was successfully used or not, but the malware, per their statements, was designed to change the records in a voter registration database for the county. So that's like the active voters. And I quote, had the capability of potentially purging 10% of the active voters in a county based off of key demographics, such as like if they're a certain party or if they live in a certain place or whatever, minority voters or whatnot. So as I said, that was briefed to the White House, but there was never any, follow-up or concern that it was actually used successfully. With that in mind, she then started telling us, and we actually went on the ground in Florida. I went to St. Lucie County and started investigating the discrepancies we were finding there in the county's records and their digital reporting. We did the same analysis we did in Pennsylvania for Florida and St. Lucie County, and we were flagging the same algorithmic voting behavior that we're concerned of. But on top of that, some of the problems we started finding was when she pulled the county records from before and after the election for their active registered voter database, one of the immediate things that jumped out to her was there was a change of around 25,000 active voters from before to after the election, meaning they disappeared or they were removed. And according to Florida law, they're supposed to document those removals of the registration database. We have not yet gotten any documentation to tell us who they purged and why, or if they actually purged them in the first place. What's interesting is that 25,000 active voters is around 10% of the registered voters in St. Lucie County. Now, that's just the registration database issues. We then went on the ground and started investigating at the precinct level, the actual voting and the counting of the votes, and if there were any issues with the voters. And we started finding immediate issues. First and foremost, we found that 38 of the 67 counties in Florida, by the way, use ES&S. So that's a substantial amount. Or sorry, I apologize. That's in Pennsylvania. Florida is almost all of the counties is a majority of ES&S systems, by the way. So in Florida, some of the major problems we found is 35 of the 61 precincts in that specific county had over 100% turnout, meaning more votes cast than active registered voters. And that's per the county's own records, which should be impossible in a free and fair
Right.
election.
This was the 35 of 61 precincts showing more votes
35 of
cast than
61.
active
Yep.
registered voters. Okay.
Active registered voters. Yes. And that's from the county themselves. That's from records requests. That's from their own documentation. They show that if we pull the active registered voters per precinct, there's more votes cast than registered voters in those precincts. And that was for over half of the precincts in that county. And on top of that, we then started investigating the actual precincts themselves. Allison did all this work, and she flagged one of the precincts was showing up in some of the records, but wasn't an official precinct, and it was a UPS store, and it had active registered voters registered to vote from it and had cast votes in the 24 election. And we went there, showed up, knocked on the door. We actually went inside his UPS store and we said, "Does anyone live here?" And they said, "God, I hope not." So that was one of the discrepancies we found that didn't really make sense. Per state law, you're not allowed to use you have to give a residential address for your voter registration. And so that was a commercial business, and there was nothing else for their records. So we don't know who these people were besides their names, and they voted from this place, or they living quotation marks in that place. That was one of the problems. We found other issues as well. We actually went to a boat marina. Same thing. Bunch of voters, active voters, said they voted in the 24 election, but didn't exist at that boat marina. The owner was kind of confused about all of the people we had named and listed. On top of that, we flagged the other concern, which is, as we said, if there's a compromise of these systems, both the counting of the votes or even the registration, well, one of the things that Allison flagged was some places that had active registered voters who voted in the 24 election were under construction during the 24 election. We went to one of those addresses, knocked on the door, and it was a very nice couple. And the reason why this was a concern is that house wasn't closed on before the election, so they shouldn't have been able to live there or vote from that address. And so we knocked on their door, we talked to them, and we said, "Hey, did you live here during the 24 election? Did you cast your vote from this address?" They said, "No, we lived in Palm Beach," which is, if you're familiar, just across the way from St. Lucie, and they voted in Palm Beach. And yet, on record, per the county, it shows they lived in that house, and the husband of the couple cast a vote in St. Lucie County, even though he voted in Palm Beach and didn't live there during the 24 election. So those were just some of the major issues we were finding. And the concern is still very much so, is there a, compromise of the counting of the votes? Is there, votes being added for people who aren't actually voting? Is there purging of voters? And, is there switching of votes as well, which is kind of what all of our findings have raised concerns for.
Now, have you gotten any, has there been any response from officials in Florida or PA, or?
There has been responses. The responses have been pretty much exactly what you would expect. Our elections are free, fair, safe, and secure. There's nothing to see here. We reached out to the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania and the governor multiple times with all of our findings as we were collecting them, and they pretty much had someone, say the same things, right? Our systems aren't connected to the internet or whatnot. Everything is secure. And they've not been willing to meet with us, and that's what led us to actual litigation in Pennsylvania. We're currently building the same litigation for Florida. The county officials have been much more nice. They've provided a lot of those records that Allison has been working with. But a lot of the time when we approach the county or the state, they're pretty much saying our hands are tied. Election law, state law says that I can't, investigate further. I can't give you access to some of these records or these ballots, which is a little insane to me, because if we're coming forward with concerns of a potential criminal compromise of election systems, it's the Secretary of the State or the Commonwealth's job to investigate these things, but they've not been willing to do so. So it is a little frustrating, and that's why we've had to pursue litigation ourselves, because the court could potentially allow more of these records to be released and more investigations to actually occur.
Now, I'm looking over the website. You have a USA map, and there's certain states that are in red. So Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Nevada, Michigan, and Minnesota. And I know you have a report on Minnesota. Can you explain the red areas on this map and the meaning?
Yes, I'll pull it up on my end, but I believe with our current map, and we are working on updating our website, electiontruthalliance.org,
I'm assuming
that's just
Florida is
showing.
meant to be there too, or no?
Yes, we are working on that to upload that. We don't currently have, so we do two types of main reports. We do a preliminary and a more robust report. So that is, some of our findings have been preliminary. All of the red states on the map are states that we have put out
That
higher
you've done
level,
reports on. Yeah.
that we've done reports on. Yes. So yes, Minnesota has been a big focus recently. It is not a swing state, and yet they have some of the best voting data going back to 1984. And we recently just put out a report going back to Ronald Reagan's elections prior to using the current systems. And we have flagged concerns of the voting behavior in that state since 1984 all the way up until 2024. And that was one of our most recent reports. So that map just shows where we've put out reports so far and where we will be going. And we want to finish all the swing states and then get into some of these more impactful states like Florida and Texas.
So why Minnesota? What did you find in the short form
Yeah.
report? I think it's called Minnesota Then Now short form report.
Yeah. So we've got a few. And as I said, I apologize. We're updating our website and just released a new multi-year report. So it may be shifted around a little bit. But main thing that led us to Minnesota was we asked a very important question. We asked if there's a problem with the counting of our votes, and if it is tied to the systems themselves, ES&S, Dominion, whatever, where could we go and get data that does two things? One, has those same major systems, but two, had areas that they hand counted during the 24 election. And so Minnesota did have precincts. I think they had a little over 30 precincts in one of their counties that was hand counted because they were small enough to do so, and they didn't count them with voting systems. So that was our first report on Minnesota. Was we actually did an analysis comparing the hand count versus machine counted precincts in a district. And we flagged that when normalizing those precincts so that they're roughly the same size, same amount of active registered voters, etc., same key demographics, the concern is pretty much we were seeing a concern with the results of the places that use the machines to count. We weren't seeing the same concern for the places that hand counted those votes. So that's what led us down the first look at Minnesota. And then, as I said, they have better voting data, and they retained it for all the way back to 1984. And we then began to publish a larger concern of the 24 election. And then we've just now published a look at 2024 in Minnesota across all of the counties, all of the precincts, 2020, 2016, and then going all the way back to, through the early 2000s as well, and then 1984 and a few others. And to summarize the concerns raised in that report, let me actually pull it up. You might want to pull it up on your end if you can. I'll send you a link as well, just so we're on the same page and I can maybe showcase some of the concerns. Let me pull that up here. See, what's the easiest way to navigate is going to be, if you actually just go to the front page, it's on the front page. It's probably the easiest way for you to see it. So currently labeled as Minnesota Then and Now short form report. There's a long form that goes with it.
Right.
And we
That's
have
the
a
one I
very
have
nice,
open. Yeah.
yep. And we have a very nice, the team made this very nice visual of one of the metrics we can use to look at elections. I like to visualize the actual precinct voting data when I do like a deep dive, and that's what a lot of our reports do. But this specific report summarizes what the findings are. And this is based off of one of the experts that we've cited a few times, Klimek et al. And he has a simple method of flagging potential vote manipulation, and it's labeled as a level of fraud. And his values go from around 0.05 as a start to up to 1, which would be 100% of something, precincts, polling locations. So that's the metric we're showcasing here, is using his method, how much of the precincts in Minnesota in each of these elections had abnormal voting behavior that could be vote manipulation, could be. And as you can see, we started in 1984, Ronald Reagan versus Mondale, which is, in my opinion, an amazing election because it mirrors some of the interesting things around the U.S. election. Ronald Reagan won in an outstanding landslide. I think he won almost all of the U.S. states except for one or two. I think he won 49 out of the 50 states or so, and absolutely destroyed Mondale. And so that was a mandate from the American people, is the argument there. And so it's really interesting to compare that to kind of our most recent elections. And key fact for those elections, for that election all the way up to 1992, is those were not counted on unified voting systems. So we were hand counting. We may have had, some other more small systems as well, but we were not using the current multi-state, single brand voting systems we are now. So it wasn't as digitized. That digitization only really began to occur after 2000, and that was because the Help America Vote Act that came out of the results of Florida and the concerns around the election actually helped fund and pay for distributing those voting systems we now use today across the U.S. So to summarize, 1984, 1990, 1988, 1992, we weren't detecting, using these methods, any concerns of mass vote manipulation or a fraud indicator. We started to flag concerns, very small concerns, in the 1996, 2000, and 2004 years, which is interesting if you're familiar with election integrity history, because those were the years that had a lot of people saying there was a lot of weirdness going on. 2004 was the concern of a man in the middle out of Ohio. 2000 was Bush versus Gore in Florida with the hanging chads. I'm not as familiar with some of the concerns around 1996, but that was when some of the same problems maybe began to occur. But you'll notice it's a very small amount. The fraud metric there was 0.05 at most, meaning maybe 5% or so of the precincts were all showing some of the same concerns. That's key. We go into 2008, 2012. We're not really detecting the same concerns there. And then, and this is the interesting piece, is 2016, 20, and 24 is when these metrics begin to detect a consistent and alarming flag of consistent voting behavior that doesn't appear to be like normal human voting behavior based off of these experts' work and their methods. And 2016 is an interesting year, as we talked about.
Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask two more questions, and I should have asked this sooner. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the methodology of the
Yeah.
Election Truth Alliance, just to give my listeners a better idea of how you're working through all of this and the analytical approaches you're taking.
Yes. So in all of our reports, we generally have a summary to methodology. If not, we actually have it under our analysis methodology page on our website. And our methodology is based on a few different experts, as I mentioned. Pretty much what kicked us off is we said, first and foremost, after the 24 election, we said, well, what is one way to potentially look at election results and determine if there's any consistent pattern that might let us look deeper? And that's where we stumbled upon Roman Udot and Sergei Shvilkin their work in Russian elections. They have a couple methods that we use. They have a few different turnout based methods that we've recreated and just expanded upon now. And then Peter Klimek et al. Put out the heat maps that we like to use as well. Very simple way of showing it. And so those are the main methods. They are based on voter turnout data at the precinct level. For the experts, they use like polling location data, which is almost the same thing for us in the U.S. It is a little bit more summarized. The precinct can have multiple polling locations in it, but it still shows, some of the same concerns. So our method pretty much says, based on these experts, what did they flag as normal versus abnormal voting behavior? And as I mentioned, these experts, Peter Klimek, Sergei Shvilkin, Roman Udot, said that there shouldn't be any strong relationship between the turnout of a location and one candidate's vote, meaning on average, higher turnout across all precincts in a county shouldn't always benefit one candidate. And even more so, there shouldn't be any consistent pattern or shifting that scales with turnout. And that is the concern we are seeing when doing these analysis, is we're actually seeing what we are concerned is a vote changing algorithm that scales with precinct turnout. And we observe this effect at this point across all of these different swing states in Philadelphia. And it seems to center around, we see in our reports in like Pennsylvania that if it's scaling with turnout, precincts of 60% and higher turnout is perhaps the threshold to which that algorithm is really kicking in and really becoming aggressive, because that's where we see this effect. And we see this effect consistently across all of these different counties and all of these different states. And that's kind of how our methodology flags how consistent and almost algorithmic that behavior and that relationship is, when these experts say that type of relationship shouldn't really exist at scale.
Last question I wanted to ask you, and I'm gonna probably botch his name, but you've worked with Professor Walter Mabin or Mabane.
Walter, yep, Dr. Walter Mebane Jr.
Okay, Walter Mebane,
Um, yeah,
University of Michigan. He's a very interesting figure because he seems very hard nosed. He will question some claims of fraud. I know that he wrote a whole piece saying that there was evidence against the idea of fraudulent votes being decisive in the Bolivia 2019 election. So sometimes he has questioned whether there was fraud in some elections in the world. And other times he said, I think there was, and this is why. It seems like he's very hard-nosed. He doesn't necessarily think, oh, there's always irregularities. But sometimes there is. He seems like he comes down from a very analytical approach, and he doesn't,
very academic.
oh, it's
Yeah.
always fraud, is what I'm getting at. So, can you talk a little bit about his work and how it ties into what you're doing? I hope I explained that well, but
No,
why I
you're
find
fine.
him
That
interesting.
was very good. And yeah, he's an amazing individual. So we currently don't have like a relationship or a partnership with him. It was very academic in the sense we actually did this where we reached out to all of these notable experts across the world. We actually reached out to Roman Udot, Sergei Shvilkin, Peter Klimek, met with some of them, exchanged some information. And Dr. Mebane was one of those individuals that's based in the U.S. that we reached out to because we stumbled upon his uh, extensive work. He's got multiple papers and multiple reports looking at U.S. and non-U.S. elections.
Yeah, I think
And he came
he's
up
looked at
with,
Iran. I think he looked at the
yes,
2004 election in the U.S. Like I said, he looked at Bolivia. He's done a lot of work.
he's done a lot of work, and he has a toolkit that he designed. He actually worked for USAID. They had a grant program, and they brought him and some other people in to design an election forensics toolkit. We've not been able to get our hands on that toolkit because USAID doesn't seem to exist anymore. But he's been trusted by the federal government to review elections and come up with ways to detect problems. So we reached out to him. We provided him copies of our collected data for Pennsylvania, and he did his independent analysis on that data and put out a working paper for 3 counties and then the whole of the state. And as you said, he's very academic and very data driven, which
He's
is the
very
key piece,
mathematically minded.
very mathematical. And so he pretty much said, here's what my work says, and that's it, which has been, mixed results. Some people have actually reached out to interview him based on the work for Pennsylvania and everything. And they said, hey, we saw that you did this report, the ETA. What are your thoughts on that? And he said, well, I don't have a relationship with the ETA. I just put out that paper. I don't endorse anything the ETA says, and that's perfectly fine. So that was kind of the main thing, is people have kind of brought up that interesting relationship. Well, you have to understand, as we said, um, he goes where the data is. And that's kind of, the sum of it is he flags, hey, here's what his work does. He does very similar types of analysis we're doing now. He's just far more complex. He uses, precinct level voting data, flags any abnormal patterns or trends. A little bit more complex than that. He has his own, software program that he's designed. But the key piece here is he's always very cautious about saying, here is the concern. Here's the scale of the concern. I don't know what caused it. And that's kind of where he ends, is he's saying this behavior is concerning. I don't know if this is actual vote manipulation or if there could be other effects. And that's kind of the beginning and the end of his input into these concerns. And, it was reaffirming for us, because we're like, are we crazy? But he did flag some of the same things that we flagged in Pennsylvania. But you have to understand, he's not willing or not able to continue down an additional path like what we've been doing, which is to actually investigate the vulnerabilities and determine what is the likelihood or not of there being an issue that is normal or not. So, he doesn't say, hey, I believe this is fraud or not. He can't say that. That's not his work. So,
Okay. Like I said, people should look into his work and what
absolutely.
on his statements. Um, Anything else that I missed or that you would like to cover in closing here? Actually, I should ask, why do you think, I know you've been on Mark Thompson's show and David Pakman's show, but I think a lot of progressive voices haven't necessarily latched onto you. And as you note, I believe on your website, Republicans and Democrats alike aren't too keen on covering this. Could you speak to that? Do you think, why do you think that there are so few voices speaking with you?
Well, I think, I think, the concerns we're raising are um, not in line with what both of those major political parties put out. And the reason is because one of those political parties has built a foundation on the security of our elections without question, and in opposition to the other, which has brought up some of the same concerns we are bringing up now, just without more of that footwork or groundwork or additional evidence and such. So I think we're both parties dislike the work we're doing because we're not doing the work for them. We're doing the work for the American people. And it's not about validating any one party. It's about making sure people's votes are being counted correctly. And we're willing to go to the places and find the evidence that the officials maybe don't want us to make public, because it kind of harms both of the parties. And I think that's an issue. The state officials have built their careers on, elections are free and fair. And to question that is, against uh, party policy. And I think that's maybe one of the issues. We've had such a hard time getting any engagement from both of those parties and both of those major media support that goes with those systems. Because, the concerns that came out of the 2020 election left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And I think
I
that's
was going to
another
say,
issue.
do you think a lot of
Yeah.
people assume when they hear Election Truth Alliance that are there people that erroneously assume that you're partisans of, say, the Republicans?
I think originally, just after the election, there was absolutely that concern of who are these people, actually working for, because to question the integrity of our election systems was consistent with one party at the time. That has now changed. Absolutely has changed now, because both parties are really not willing to engage with the actual evidence and the actual concerns we have. And I think now when people see the work we're doing, they're more um, intrigued and being like, well, what are these people saying and who are they saying it for? And they'll find very quickly we're not saying it for a party. We're saying it for, fixing a system and validating votes for the American people, which makes us, a very interesting position as we continue to push forward.
Well, then, so closing out here, what could be done to fix this system?
Right. Well, the first step, as everyone likes to say, is the first step is admitting there's a problem. The first step is publicizing these things that we're finding, these vulnerabilities, these compromises, and these alarming voting trends, and getting people to realize that the data and the facts are this, you're being told this. And that's kind of the first step to pursuing change. One of the goals of the ETA is not only the publicity, but we are seeking through our legal action or through, other means to get an actual review and verification of the paper ballots.
Yeah, it broke up a little bit. I don't know where you cut off though.
Oh, you're fine. I was just going to say, as you said, what can we do? Well, first step, publicity. Second step is the ETA has, started taking methods to try and get answers before the midterms, which is the next big major election. And if there's a problem with these systems, we're concerned that the same problems could exist in the midterms. So we are pursuing litigation at this point. We've raised over $200,000 to fight legal battles, and we'll obviously, I think we've spent over $60,000 so far in just the lawsuit in Pennsylvania and retaining lawyers in Florida and such. But I think that's the first step. For normal Americans, really this is something that you should at least be aware of and maybe share the concerns or review the concerns yourself, right? I'm not going to tell you what to believe or what to do. We just put the data out and the concerns out, and you can kind of go from there. And really the main goal we have is, if this is a problem and this can continue again, how could we detect it and react upon it in the next major election? And so some of that work, as well as we are putting out our own toolkit soon that will let anyone and everyone do the types of analysis we do. You just need to get the data yourself. That'll be useful in anyone and everyone being able to review their own races or counties or states, since we can't be everywhere. And then on top of that, the candidates who will be running should be aware of these vulnerabilities, so that if there are problems and those symptoms do come up during their election, they can contest and get a hand count, which is not normal. Most election officials are afraid to do that. That is almost taboo because of what happened in the 2020 election.
Well, I want to thank you again, Nathan Tiller, for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with the work the ETA is doing?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And hopefully I answered a lot of your questions. We put out almost all of our engagement on our YouTube channel and our website. So electiontruithalliance.org on our website, and then Election Truth Alliance on YouTube. And we have a newsletter that you can sign up for as well. So that's how we like to keep people up to date. I do a lot of update videos, or we'll put up, posts and such. And that's how people can kind of follow along with new findings and any calls to action. We occasionally will have like a call to action when we put out a new state report and say, hey, reach out to the governor and secretary of state, and, send them letters about these concerns if you are concerned. So those are the best ways.
Thank you again, Nathan Tiller.
Thanks so much.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.